Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Venus retrograde in Gemini webinar. You can see the dates on your screen, and this is time-wise across the United States. Venus turns retrograde May 12th, 13th, and goes direct June 24th, 25th, as you can see, from basically 22 to 5 degrees Gemini. Before we get started on our subject matter tonight, though, first of all, we have our housekeeping slide. And I've added a new one to the list. Our YouTube channel is back. Yahoo! So when you get the PDF of all of these PowerPoint slides, these links should be activated, so you can click on the link to our YouTube channel or anything else you see on our screen, and you should be able to go directly to anywhere these links will take you. And as I've done for the last 3-4 Venus retrograde cycles, if anybody is interested in a compatibility reading, you can get the second chart for no extra charge. Works out to be about 25% off my regular price, and doesn't have to be intimate partners. It can be parent-child, it can be a boss, it can be friends, it can be anybody you want to look at relationship karma with. And so Venus in Gemini, one sign, April 3rd through August 7th of 2020. The longest transit that Venus makes through a sign of the zodiac always takes place in the midst of its retrograde cycle. And typically when that happens, it means Venus spends 4 months in one sign of the zodiac. When it's on the far side of the sun, it can go through a sign of the zodiac as fast as 2.5 to 3 weeks. So there's a lot of variable there for all the inner planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, as they dance with Earth around the sun. So if you want to put this retrograde cycle down into one phrase, are we open-minded and curious, or are we going to be closed-minded and shut down, taking in any information at all? So in the midst of all that, though, it is necessary to quiet our mind and breathe. It is necessary to energize relaxation. And with the mutable quadrant, it is very, very helpful to get ourselves out in nature. Here are the dates for you from exterior conjunction last August to the next one in March of 21. So here are the dates as well when Venus went into shadow, moved into that first passage of 5 to 22 Gemini. You can see the retrograde dates, the interior conjunction in early June, and then of course when it goes direct, and the post-shadow dates as well. I'll have this slide up more than once for you, but before we get into all the details of Gemini, I want you to pay attention just for a moment here. I'm going to get my highlighter on for you. I think this is, nope, that's not the one I like. The laser pointer, this one. I want you to pay attention here, these dates, Venus going retrograde May 12th, 13th to direct June 24th, 25th, because this Venus retrograde is contained within these 3 outer planets turning retrograde and direct. Venus retrograde May 12th through 13th. If you haven't been paying attention this week, boom, boom, boom. Saturn, Venus, Jupiter within 4 or 5 days of each other turning stationary retrograde. And it's only what, Monday? Let's see what the rest of this week brings us in regards to surprises and chaos and throwing things up in the air. So again, this Venus retrograde is marching along in the middle of the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto stellium retrograde cycles. And as you will see, Venus is activating with aspects to all three of these. Regardless of what you see in your astro calendars, Venus makes aspects to every single planet in the zodiac during this retrograde cycle. More details as we go along. Also on your screen, I'll point out, just in case you're not aware of this, we had that Saturn-Pluto conjunction January 12th. We're going to have 3 Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions. And then the end of this year on the winter solstice, Jupiter's finally going to have a conjunction with Saturn at 0.5 Aquarius. This is a lot of the intensity that we're seeing this year with these 3 planets traveling so close together. However, as I said, this Jupiter retrograde is going to be a little more impactful just because of the context of what's going on. And what is that, you may ask? Oh, has anybody heard there's a pandemic in the world? So in general, the Gemini Sagittarius polarity rules the respiratory system. On a physical basis, I like to say that Gemini rules taking breath in, and Sagittarius rules letting breath out. So breath in, breath out. And as we know right now, a contagion on a physical level is the spread of disease through close contact or through the breath. Every month that goes along, you learn more and more and more about all of the viral particles as well as everything else that's just in your regular breathing. Whether you have the COVID-19 and you're asymptomatic or you are, coughing all over the place, it can be quite invisible and still be there. And this is something we're all really starting to learn in consciousness with the Gemini Sag polarity. Now, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, Gemini rules gathering and taking information and facts in. Sagittarius rules making sense of everything and releasing what is not relevant. So you can take those 2 sentences right there. There's a lot of your Venus in retrograde as well. One more point, of course, and if you want to know more details on this, I just did a webinar on the nodal axis in Gemini Sag, and you can go to our website and purchase that and get all the PDF slides and a lot more detail on this subject if you'd like to. But we just had the North Node move into Gemini and the South Node move into Sagittarius May 5th, where they will be through January 18th of 2022. And it looks like this particular Gemini Sagittarius cycle is going to be one of the baseline timings of this coronavirus pandemic. I want to point out we do not always have a pandemic every time we have the nodes in Gemini Sagittarius, regardless of which nodes where. It has a lot to do with the context. One of the basics we learn in evolutionary astrology, observe and correlate. And so you've got to be able to put it in the context of the person or put it in context of the environment or country, or in this particular case, the collective human species in order for it to be relevant. So with this pandemic, Venus retrograde in Gemini can exacerbate the entire transmission of the COVID-19 through travel. Gemini Sagittarius rules short distance, long distance traveling. It rules all of the public transit, whether you're taking the bus, the subway, the train, or the airplane. And so with Venus retrograde in Gemini, will we even see a flattening of the curve in some countries before it starts to expand again? For example, South Korea, that was one of the countries that was extremely fast in setting up a lot of testing and contact tracing. And they started opening up various business there. And it's just been reported in the news in the last couple of days that their contact tracing is finding that there's expansions of the virus wherever they have opened up restaurants, bars, and nightclubs. Now, you can substitute that with church. You can substitute that with protest, a music concert. Take your pick. Um, it's going to be a lot of wait and see. And what are the Gemini facts and information that come out through this retrograde cycle? Venus is always about our values. And so as it's retrograde in Gemini, there's a shifting of our values all over the place for each of us as individuals and for businesses. And for instance, here in the United States, where's our individual and business freedoms versus the safeguards that we need to put into place for elderly, the outbreaks in nursing homes, those who are impaired with chronic diseases, and those who are impoverished, who don't have the ability to social distance themselves from their extended families. All of this will continue to be in the news through this entire Venus retrograde cycle. And I'm probably going to be a repetitious voice in saying that with this particular retrograde cycle, it's going to consume a lot of what we consider facts versus opinions. What do we consider fake news? Inhaling a disinfectant? That was kind of a interesting thing. More slides on that. So we can expect social media chaos during this Venus retrograde cycle. In the world of fact checking and also in the world of damage control, it's going to be all over the place. And it really will behoove each of us to really take a deep, open minded look, deep Sagittarius, open minded Gemini, to see where is reality. One of the things that can happen is we can so easily remain stuck in our opinions and our beliefs. Or one of the other things with Venus retrograde in Gemini, I can't decide, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do, I don't know which way to go. Here again, take a deep breath and put yourself in nature, even if it's opening the window 50 stories up in your high rise, as best as you can. Because breath in, breath out, when you can do it in a free space, is one of the best ways to help you process through this information that's bombarding us through this Venus retrograde cycle. So here's a little bit on Venus astronomy. It actually goes around the sun once every 225 days. But with its retrograde cycle, it'll take anywhere from 9 to 14 months to go make a complete cycle from Aries to Pisces. Venus happens to be, the rarest of the retrograde cycles. It is only retrograde 7% of the time, or approximately once every year and a half for 40 to 43 days. When Venus turns retrograde and direct, it actually stands still in the sky for about 2 days. You can extrapolate that into 4 or 5 days of Venus appearing to stand still. Now, I'll give you some visual on this, but once every 8 years, 5 Venus retrograde cycles make a 5-pointed star or a pentagram. And each of the 5 points on the retrograde cycle occurs 2 to 3 days earlier and 2 to 3 degrees earlier whenever it's active on one of those points. Meaning this Venus retrograde turning stationary retrograde at 22 degrees Gemini, the time before it turned retrograde at 24, 25 degrees Gemini back in 2012. It takes 104 years for Venus to reverse through a sign on each point of the pentagram. Here's a visual for you. Right now, the Venus retrograde cycles are taking place, and I'll show you in Aries to Pisces. And then we come over and they happen in Scorpio to Libra, which was the last one in the fall of 18. And then they happen right now in Gemini. The next one that's going to come along in, I think it's early 2022. It's going to be Aquarius Capricorn and then Leo Virgo before we start over again. Here's the years Venus was retrograde in Gemini. And if you're familiar with the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty who fell asleep for 100 years, there is the theory that this relates to the Venus cycle. If you're not familiar with this, after the moon, let me get this, yeah, after the moon, Venus is the next brightest object in the skies, followed by Jupiter. So our ancestors did a lot of watching the nighttime skies with Venus. And the next two slides are coming from Shamanic Astrology with Daniel Giamario. And he has put forth a mythology for Venus in which Venus has a 584 day. That's that one cycle from retrograde to retrograde from Earth's point of view. He's put together a shamanic death and rebirth cycle. And, this is based upon studying the nighttime skies and the old folklore. So we have what we call Venus as a morning star, which is about 8 to 9 months. It starts with the heliacal rising during a retrograde cycle. This next one is going to be June 9th of 2020, when Venus will first appear in the morning sky retrograde at about 10.5 degrees Gemini. And then Venus is going to whoosh its way up to the heavens as a morning star, and it will then slowly make 7 waning Moon-Venus conjunctions as Venus rises and sets in the sky. This is known as descending into the underworld. And every time Moon-Venus makes one of these conjunctions in the morning sky, these are known as gates or chakras, and Venus releases a vestment or a garment. And I don't know the details of all the 7 things she releases. But it is known as Venus dying to its old self. And then Venus descends into the underworld for anywhere from 60 to 90 days. And this is when it's on the far side of the sun and it makes that exterior conjunction going direct, but it's so far away from Earth that it spends a long time in that underworld. And this is called the death by intent. And then Venus will start to show up as an evening star. And Venus will be an evening star for 8 or 9 months. And we will see 7 waxing Moon-Venus conjunctions in the evening, Venus evening star, as Venus rises and then sets in the sky and goes back into that underworld. Now we are just finishing up with these 7 Moon-Venus waxing conjunctions. And so these are known as Venus gaining wisdom and insight. And so we're just getting ready now to have that Venus retrograde, birth by intent. And then again, we'll start over with this heliacal rising in this current cycle, June 9th at about 10.5 degrees Gemini. This happens after the interior conjunction, because that interior conjunction, when Venus is in between Sun and Earth, we can't see that. That's lining up and the sun's too bright for us to actually have a visual on Venus. Archetypically, Venus has rulership of two signs currently. So we have an inner side of Venus and an outer. The inner side is its rulership of Taurus in the second house. You can see here, I just put down keywords for you. The inner side, self-acceptance, self-love, self-sex, the survival instinct, food, clothing, shelter. Then we go to resources beyond survival, beauty, art, wealth, etc. This is where we see ourself as a resource. In other words, with the Taurus second house side of Venus, we learn talents to create resources. We learn how to survive. It's also self-reliance. And with this rulership, it's physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. It's not just the physical of the earth element. It's being able to provide for ourselves on all four levels, because again, self-acceptance, self-love, taking care of ourselves emotionally, mentally, spiritually as well. This is also where we learn what it is that we value, because it determines what we perceive we need, which creates that desires that we activate with Mars. This side of Venus also has rulership of the physical senses. Touch. I probably don't have them in order. I used to know them, but you can see them on your screen. Distortions, hoarding, stubbornness, possessiveness, indulgence, poverty, prostitution, isolation, materialistic. We can go from no resources to extreme of resources all over the place. I did not know this, but I just recently used Bill Gates on a public talk. He's a second house Pluto soul. He's a Taurus soul, and he is currently second richest man in the world. We also have the outer side of Venus, which is rulership of Libra in the seventh house. And so this is where we have relationships outside of ourselves. And from EA's perspective, they're only as good as the relationship we have inside with ourselves. Here we're learning relationship diversity, relating to a variety of people. That always gives us that feedback, that compare and contrast of ourselves with others, leading us to greater self-knowledge. This outer side of Venus is known as the psychology of listening, which helps us improve actual communications outside of ourselves. It is giving and receiving, and this includes learning when to give and when not to give in the greater giving. And of course, this is about fairness, equality, and balance. Distortions that can come from outer Venus: inequality, codependencies, projections and expectations onto relationships, idealizing someone, wearing a mask, lack of boundaries, going to extremes, being a philanderer, being possessive, needy. All of those wounded relationship words that we can go through when planets transit the seventh house or Libra. So why do we have planetary retrogrades? They're actually a Earth-centered or geocentric phenomena. They're more powerful because the retrograde planet is always in close proximity to Earth. When the case of Venus and Mercury, when they're retrograde, they're in between the sun and Earth. They're as close as they get to planet Earth. Planetary retrogrades offer us an opportunity to break free from all of the consensus conditionings relative to whatever planet is retrograde. It causes us to withdraw from that status quo so we can redefine that planetary archetype according to our own individual natural law. With Venus, last two slides I just showed you. And of course, when a planet is retrograde, that then means withdrawing from the status quo. Answers to retrograde lessons come from within ourselves. That's in general. Can you see how that can be emphasized with a Venus retrograde? Planetary retrograde is always non-static. It's moving backwards. It's continually trying to evolve. The sign in the house of the retrograde will be how it is manifesting. The opposite sign and house will be the clarity, objectivity, and expression in a more holistic way. Transiting retrograde planets are always related back to the natal planetary archetype. So take a moment. Where do you have natal Venus? By sign, by house, by aspects. That also is going to be activated during this Venus retrograde. Why we will all experience Venus retrograde in Gemini. We will also have an individual flavor of it by our natal Venus. If you were one of the people born with Venus retrograde, again, only 7% of the time, you get a temporary harmony during the Venus retrograde. However, I will point out, if you were born with Venus retrograde, you are spending this entire lifetime rebelling against the status quo relating. I got 2 words in there, don't I? Okay, let me get my little circle there so I can correct that one. So we're rebelling against the status quo of inner and outer relationships. How does society say you relate to yourself? Some support it, some don't. How does society say you relate to others outside of yourself? You're going to be rebelling against both. Now, specifically when Venus is retrograde in Gemini, we need to first of all understand a natural part of the Gemini cycle. Gemini is the active polarity, energy moving outside of self, but it reaches a fullness, or I can't take anything else in, and then it goes into contraction. It's the duality of an air sign. And so Gemini has a contraction side that is just as natural as its expansion side. When a planet goes retrograde in Gemini, it can trigger that going inward in general. And then Venus having its own inner side through rulership of Taurus second is another signature, throwing us back in upon ourself. This can create an individual alienation, and its purpose turning us inward to discover our own unique evolving values. Before the pandemic, what was important to you? Now in the midst of the pandemic, how are your values changing? Perhaps we might be a more social person, and it was important to us to go out to the club or to go to yoga 3-4 times a week. And through the midst of this, all of a sudden, we're having to learn how to value yoga in our living room. We are reaching for new levels of learning how to love ourselves and accept ourselves, and especially to do this mentally. I'm okay. I'm okay through all of this shelter in place. I will go up and down the stairs in my house. This is literally me. However many times I have to when the weather doesn't let me outside. If you live in a big high rise, can you go up and down those stairs just to breathe with your mask on? And get the points. It's also a time period to try out new ideas around self-reliance. I rely on myself to meet all my needs. To try out new ideas with those talents. All the job chaos going on. What am I doing? Did I go get a part-time gig job? Am I using this time to learn how to sew again? I pulled out my sewing machine. Oh, what is it? Katie OK or OK Katie? There's a funny YouTube going around about a woman sewing cloth masks and coming out with band-aids all over her fingers and a new outfit because she sewed her blouse to her mask. It was a joke on a new talent. And of course, anytime we have Venus retrograde, how do we go about providing for our own resources better? In Gemini, it may be trying a bunch of different things to see what works, what sticks. It'll have many of us working to try something new. It will also be, of course, as we learn new ways of relating to ourselves, leading into then new ways of relating to others. Status quo relating patterns are no longer acceptable. And this is not just intimate relationships, but with Venus retrograde, all relationships undergo changes. And with Venus retrograde in Gemini, it's the communications, whether it's writing or speaking. Are you finding yourself sending a text to someone and it's totally misunderstood? Sometimes it's easier to get on the phone with someone. With another person, you never get off the phone and it's easier to send them that text. There's an increase of communications through the 4 months Venus is in Gemini. And it's going to be emphasized as we go through the 6 weeks of the retrograde cycle. And we're going to have to communicate again and again and again until we can reach common understandings, the common ground around how everyone involved is emerging their values. And as we do that, as our values change, we want our relationships to change. It doesn't work to do it the way that we used to. And so, of course, not only are we going to have that psychology of listening with Venus, but we also are going to have to learn to speak up. So sometimes we have to listen, sometimes we have to speak. And how do you balance that? If you need to listen, somebody may be interrupting you. If you've been listening and listening and listening, you may need to shut someone up and interrupt and say, my turn. There will also be, Gemini, choices and decisions about where to apply our energy and effort. And with this Venus retrograde, it can feel like there's too much. There's too many details. There's too much to consider. There's too much to do with everything that's going on planet Earth. If you're someone who eats out a lot and all of a sudden the restaurants aren't open, you have to learn how to cook again or get really good at TV dinners from, the grocery store or spend even more money ordering out. Probably each and every one of us in some ways have had our day-to-day schedule, hour to hour, moment to moment, Gemini shifting through Venus in Gemini and perhaps intensifying as it goes retrograde. So we have to learn a pacing here with Gemini. And we have to learn how to take time to completely address any situation, Sagittarius polarity versus rushing through Gemini. So, can you be curious? Can you remain open for learning a new way to do something or understanding a new way to do something? And then through that, as we said before, I'm going to say more than once, taking time to breathe, consider before actually taking action. It's one of the nice things with Venus. If Mars is retrograde in Gemini, it is really hard to slow down and not just do it. Venus retrograde in Gemini, it can be a little more conducive to actually slowing down and thinking before we take actions on anything. There can also be social alienation with Venus retrograde in general. And with Venus retrograde in Gemini, another air sign, natural rulership Libra, Venus will be searching for new equalities, new balance, new giving and sharing. So Gemini will be questioning how we and others relate. And how do we put our life together in a more holistic and balanced way? And then how do we put our life together in relationships with others in more holistic and balanced ways? Do we go along with the crowd? And now Venus retrograde, it's like, I can't do that anymore. Um, you know, there are those who've been saying, or there's been the jokes going around social media about the COVID-19. Remember the freshman 15, whenever you go to college and you put on that, those freshman 15 pounds? Well, they're calling it the COVID-19 because everybody's home and everybody's cooking and you can't get, flour in the United States. You can't buy yeast because everybody's cooking and everybody's putting on their COVID-15. Leroy and I made a conscious decision to not eat out, to learn how to cook again, and to learn how to eat in healthier ways. And so we've actually been doing the opposite of the COVID-15. We both have been releasing weight. And it is a value that is gaining momentum with us because we feel better. And so collective value systems are being reevaluated from the broadest level of the country or culture you're participating in, all the way down to what I just described in an intimate relationship that Leroy and I have with nutrition. So that's just one example. With Gemini, where's that retrograde by house? And where's that polarity, Sagittarius, by house? That may describe how you're trying to change relationship within yourself and relationships with others. It may even describe the type of relationships with others. Now, of course, some of the distortions to tap into those again. With Venus retrograde in Gemini, there can be a lack of communication, refusing to talk about it. There can be refusal to consider another point of view. There can be outright lies or subtle lies and all the con artist games. Then another distortion with Gemini is arguing for the sake of arguing and just going round and round in circles and creating chaos because you just want to be disruptive. We can also find through this Venus retrograde in Gemini that we can experience what we call brain switching. And that's where we go back and forth, left brain, right brain, left brain, right brain. Left brain, logical side, Gemini. Right brain, intuition side, Sagittarius. And we can just get caught up in back and forth, again, especially if we're in overwhelm. And it can lead to confusion or an inability to think very clearly. It can have us mistrusting the intuition when it rises up. We discount it. We have to go in and rationalize it and dissect it to pieces until it doesn't matter. And so we've really got to remember that when Venus is retrograde in Gemini, it points to that polarity Sagittarius. And this behooves us to be as honest as possible with ourselves and to reach into deep philosophical reflections about life. What do I believe? How are my beliefs changing? How are my relationships, resources, communications? And in this particular retrograde, how are things changing with my health and feeling safe? And so we have our inner conversations and reflections about this, and we have it outer with others. Again, trying to communicate and reach those, deep philosophical foundations that allow us to calm down, allow us to feel better, allow us to have an inner peace through the chaos taking place right now. And as we look at this Sagittarius archetype, one of the things to recognize here is the relativity of truth on the path to universal timeless truth. In other words, there's universal natural law, timeless truth that always has and will exist. But currently on Earth, there's about 7.8, 7.9 billion ways of tapping into that truth. And it can be a personal truth for us, but it can be a limitation of universal truth. And so Venus retrograde in Gemini points towards letting go of my own personal truth, especially mentally, and how I have my mental security caught up with it. And follow the intuitive hits coming through, or discovering a different perspective through a conversation with someone. So we're going to review our moral truths, our moral norms and laws, our religious and spiritual norms and laws with this retrograde cycle. And so, of course, this brings up the whole truth versus lies theme. So, Gemini can have the truth or the lie. Sagittarius can have the truth or the lie. It's not an either or. Both can be as honest as they come, and both can lie to the max. It's going to be that observation and correlation context for each individual involved. We can see polarities on various issues intensify as well as be exposed. Who's telling the truth and who's lying? And it can be very easy for people to become too excited or triggered or angry to listen. Take that deep breath. Count to 10, count to 100. So Gemini and Sagittarius rules journalism. They rule writing and speaking. And so we will watch the media be in the news through this Venus retrograde cycle. And we will see one more time an expansion of debating who has the truth. We can get overwhelmed with everything that's coming at us. And so one of the things that we'll look at is fact-based journalism versus propaganda journalism. Each of us will be having to review our social media. Each of us are going to have to take a second look, a deeper look, a broader look at all the disinformation that is out there. I have one for you in a couple of slides here that I will use as example. And of course, Sagittarius has rulership of legal issues and lawsuits because laws are based upon philosophical orientations. We have the philosophy with Sag, and then we have the rule or the consensus norm with Capricorn. Both Sag and Capricorn can create laws, as we well, no, in many countries, but they're always based upon some philosophical orientation. Female, my body, my choice, or all life is precious, to give you an example. Sagittarius in general rules nature and natural spiritual principles. And so here is why we have been saying with the Gemini Sagittarius polarity through this Venus retrograde cycle, make that consistent effort to get out in nature in order to balance and recenter your relationship with the natural world, which will very much help you in your relationship with this pesky species we call humans. By the way, on your screen there, you can see a book called Beyond Contempt by Erica Edelson. I ran across this book a few months ago. I haven't read it yet, but I did order it, and I do have a copy on it that I will make my way through this summer after I get done with my latest public banking book. I'm finally making my way through Ellen Brown's new book, and I have a little picture of that as we go along too. So if our philosophical orientation is inclusive, we're orientated to the facts that support that. If our philosophical orientation is exclusive, we are orientated to the facts that support that. And this will be very emphasized with this Venus retrograde cycle. You will see how it's emphasized in a few slides. In the course, two of the charts that I use, the United States chart, thank you international listeners, and of course Donald Trump's chart, thank you again international listeners. Here's our dates one more time, shadow time periods, the Venus retrograde, and direct dates, degrees, and of course the interior conjunction of Venus with the Sun. Here's the Venus stationary retrograde chart. And probably one of the biggest things that we can point out right now as it turns retrograde is the fact that we've just had the nodal axis go into Gemini Sagittarius. We won't see the North Node go over Venus until August 15th or August 5th this summer of 2020 at 28 degrees Gemini. But as Venus goes through this retrograde cycle and then goes direct in Gemini to meet the North Node as well, we find that this North Node is reversing through Gemini throughout throughout the Venus retrograde cycle. And so this lends an energy to this North Node here throughout most of 2020, in which it behooves us to adapt as best as possible to a changing world. And relative to Venus, how are we needing to move our value systems forward? I'm a gardener. I was raised on a farm. I dig in the dirt a lot. I like those, I feel like I have a healthy immune system just digging in the dirt and all the microbes I get underneath my fingernails. I haven't always been the best at washing my hands. And yet now, especially if I find myself out in the public, I'm a lot better at washing my hands and drying them and using those paper towels bundled up to open the door when I'm going out of something. Here's the little slide I wanted to show you. It's odd. You never see a country with universal health care trying to repeal it. You can't read this. This is a list of the countries that adopted some form or percentage of universal health care and the dates that they did it. The earliest one on this slide is Norway in 1912. And the latest one, Israel in 1995, it looks like, if I'm reading it correctly. But I do the Google searches, and I just Googled universal healthcare coverage, and I got a plethora of, and I did images. I got a plethora of little slides like that for pro and con, and pro and con, and pro and con, and pro and con. And I started looking at it a little bit, and I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. Venus retrograde in Gemini. Oh, this is an interesting use of facts and words. Oh, that's interesting. And then I ran across this one, and I thought, you know, Britain, with its National Health Service, NHS, was really coming under a lot of anti, cutting defunding and all that kind of stuff, until Prime Minister Boris Johnson ended up in the IC unit with COVID-19, and now singing a little bit of a different tune. Let's see where that one goes. But that's the closest I've come to. If there was a country that repealed universal health care, the United States conservative press would be screaming it from the rooftops. So this is part of this whole picture of transiting Neptune in Pisces, which is not only in orbit squaring the nodes through most of this year, but Venus through this retrograde cycle is making 3 waxing squares to Neptune in Pisces, bringing in the whole flavor of the immune system, which Neptune rules in general, survivalism, which is a Venus word. Venus goes stationary direct with Mars conjunct Neptune, and Venus getting ready to make the second of 3 squares to Mars. Venus will make 3 waxing squares to not only Neptune, but Mars as well. Venus has a lot of aspects with this retrograde cycle. 4 different aspects to Mercury. And as you can see on your screen here, the sesquisquadrates to Jupiter and Saturn, the semi-sextile to Uranus. The only ones that will really show up probably in general on your screen are the sextile to Chiron and the square to Neptune. But there are 3 to Mars as you spread it out over the year, which I do. Evolutionary astrology works with the whole 30 to 360 cycle of phases and aspects. So here's the Venus interior retrograde interior conjunction to the Sun. It is on June 3rd. It will take place at 13.5 degrees Gemini. 2 days later, we will have a North Node lunar eclipse with the Sun at 15.5 Gemini and the Moon at 15.5 degrees Sag. And so what I sense from this, the confusion and misinformation, outright lies. That will be some of the undertakings that will be in the news here, just by nature of it being a lunar eclipse. However, because the Sun is on the North Node, it is a North Node eclipse season, which is always about moving forward. So this Venus retrograde is going to require us to have some persistence in moving forward. Now, the highlight of any planetary retrograde cycle is when the planet either conjuncts, as in the case of Mercury and Venus, the Sun, or opposes, as is the cases Mars throughout. It is the time period of maximum insights into whatever the retrograde lessons are about. Venus retrograde in Gemini, talking and walking our evolving value systems, improving our communications about what really matters most to us in our world. And then how well can we recognize that same respect for others' values? I didn't put this in here, but there is an old adage that your freedom ends at my nose. And it is representative of you have freedom to do what you want as long as it is not hurtful to me. Well, your freedom ends at my nose. That's like you don't have the right to hit me in the face. That may be changing with this Venus retrograde cycle to your freedom ends 6 feet away or 10 feet away. We'll see how that moves through. But I think you get the point. We're discussing this type of value about this common air that we breathe and how easy it is for a germ to be exposed by someone. You've probably seen pictures on the internet, a freedom loving protester with no mask, inches away from the face of a police officer who is trying to protect something. So that's a whole changing value with this retrograde cycle. And this lunar eclipse is going to intensify the aha moments. Some will break through and evolve us in changes, and others could end up in some confusion or a new lie being projected as the norm. Stay tuned, we'll all live through it. Most of us, I hope all of us. Mercury has 4 different aspects to Venus, and as I was doing my review, I only put in 3 of the 4. I left out the semi-square. It starts with a sextile and goes to a conjunction. And with the retrograde, there are 3 semi-sextiles, both waning and waxing. Mercury and Venus dance from conjunctions to sextiles with each other. They, with their being so close to the sun, they don't ever get that far away from our geocentric viewpoint. Mercury is either the sign before, sign of, sign after your birth sign, sun sign. Venus, 2 signs before, sign of, or 2 signs after your sun sign because they're so close to the sun. So with each other, they dance pretty close. So Mercury is going to catch up and pass over Venus May 22nd at about 20 degrees Gemini, and it will be ahead of Venus until next February 13th when they meet at a Venus retrograde cycle at about 15 degrees Aquarius. As Mercury pulls ahead of Venus during this retrograde cycle, it again becomes the conscious mind Mercury needing to slow down and reconsider the Venusian value systems. And if you want to, that's kind of how you can just look at their dance together. And I usually explain this one way or another, however they're dancing during the Mercury retrograde webinars. So because Venus is traveling through Gemini from April 3rd to August 7th, those 4 months again, its transit and the retrograde cycle is going to feel like one long Mercury retrograde cycle. It's a de facto Mercury retrograde cycle. Venus is going retrograde through one of the signs Mercury rules. So all the Mercury retrograde stuff start to come into play here. Pay attention to those details. Check things again and again. Communicate them, verbally, written, however you need to do it. One more time. Breathe and focus on what is most important. What is of value to you in your changing world? I would consider this 4-month transit a time period to declutter and organize and prioritize. Whatever's been piling up, is it the clothes in your closet that you didn't fold? Is it the paperwork that's sitting on your desk? Is it the garage from a cold winter that you just threw everything in and all of a sudden, why am I hanging on to this? You name it. You can come up with the things that you can declutter and organize in your world. There's a lot of social media going around with that stuff as well. People who work all of a sudden being at home, going to go through this closet, going to go through this junk drawer, whatever it is. Typically, as we release things and simplify, it has this effect of quieting the mind. It has the effect of helping us feel more organized. As you see on your screen, Mercury is going to go retrograde just before Venus goes direct. Mercury goes retrograde June 17th. Venus goes direct June 24th, 25th. From the 17th to the 25th, for that week, we'll have 6 planets retrograde. Pluto, Neptune, Saturn, Jupiter, Venus, Mercury. So Venus's retrograde cycle entirely in Cancer, 15 to 5 degrees, is going to bring an emotional ending to our Venusian values review. So as you move through this Venus retrograde, whatever it is, your resources, your relationships, your job, whatever it is, as Venus turns stationary direct, Mercury is going to give you an opportunity to check in emotionally and see if you're congruent with your world. One more time. The end of this Venus retrograde cycle, pay attention to the emotional hits, as it'll help you bring it all together and really move forward with Venus direct in Gemini, that third passage from 5 to 22 degrees. And you won't be in the confusion and the overwhelm. You'll be able to click, 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 move forward. And of course, as you see on your screen, here's the date of we always do a pay it forward free Mercury retrograde webinar, June 15th. With Venus and Mars, they had a conjunction last summer at about 4 Virgo. And Venus, between January through September, is going to make 3 waxing squares to Mars. In each time, they are both in different signs of the zodiac. So, a Venus-Mars cycle is anywhere from 23 to 28 months, depending on their retrogrades. And they will always have anywhere from 1 to 3 conjunctions. And they always will have 1 opposition when Mars is retrograde. And that is because Venus is never far from the Sun. So when the Sun opposes Mars, Venus opposes Mars. And Mars will have a conjunction with the Sun 1 year, and the next year it has an opposition. The following year, a conjunction. The following year, opposition. Mars has a 2-year cycle, and so that's how it works out with the Sun. So again, Venus, Mars, 3 conjunctions, but they will never have more than 1 opposition. So the first quarter squares, Venus is working hard to implement new value systems, new communication styles, Gemini, new relating patterns, Venus, first quarter square Mars. And of course, because they are each in different signs with these 3 squares, the subject matter will be all over the place. Probably the common theme, though, with the Venus retrograde, which is what's creating 3 of these waxing squares. New value systems, new communications, new relationships. We're wanting things to change, and we're probably wanting it changing relative to how we are all changing our relationship to an invisible virus. And so, your ability to clearly communicate how things are changing in your world can make or break an intimate relationship right now. There has been an increase in custody lawsuits amongst divorced parents, having differing values over how to protect the children from COVID-19. There has been increases in domestic violence because of the living in close quarters when one or both parties are now working from home and or have been laid off and losing resources. This Venus retrograde cycle can create some spur of the moment violence. And the Venus retrograde waxing square to Mars is the day before the interior conjunction to the sun, the highlight of the retrograde cycle, and 3 days before the lunar eclipse, that early June time period. You want to be very, very careful in relationships. If you are in a vulnerable relationship, you may want to consider ways to protect yourself during that time period. We will also find that this viral pandemic is going to bring about more relationship initiations with those online dating apps. Oh, not so easy to go to one of those social events or places right now. I am bored out of my mind. I was thinking about starting to date again this year. Now what am I going to do? We want to take it a little slow, a little carefully. It's going to make communicating clearly even more important because with online relationships, it's pretty easy to manipulate the photo, beautiful photo of them, and they show up in person and the guy doesn't have as much hair, one or either, isn't as thin as they were in the photograph. Something's changed. Also, perhaps the distortions with what their lifestyles really like or what their value systems really are. It's important to just communicate and say, oh, hiking is very important to me. And then you start dating and they never want to walk around the block. And of course, it's classic, no matter what sign Venus is retrograde in, for ex-partners to show up. And I have a tendency to say in general, if you have an ex show up during Venus retrograde, it's an opportunity to clarify the ending. And if it's something to start over again, you take it slow, slow, slow. Venus Mars will also bring new actions in relationship to our resources. Venus is always resources in the current contracting societies. So we're not only going to look at our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with others, one-on-one or groups. We're looking at this from a societal perspective as well. How do we support gig workers in an economic downturn? They're independent, self-employed, who I just read an article in their little local newspaper about a massage therapist who was just going great guns, just a good business, making really good money on her own, independently, been doing it for several years. And all of a sudden, her income went to zero. And she cannot get through with our state laws filing for unemployment. And if she can't get that, then she doesn't get that $600 a week that the federal government passed for 13 weeks for those unemployed. It's topsy-turvy out there, Gemini, under what the rule is or isn't and how you get it and how you don't. Venus Mars can bring the energy to try and do something about it. And of course, as we go through this year, with 3 of these Venus Mars first quarter squares, no matter what the subject matter is, when they get to their opposition November 9th, a few days after the US presidential election, everything comes to a head or reward in creating new levels of equality in relationships. Stay tuned. We'll see how that one turns out. Of course, this Venus opposition to Mars is going to take place in the middle of the Mars retrograde in Aries. Class on that later this summer as that gets closer to us. Here are the aspects that Venus will make 3 times each to Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. These are called waxing sesquisquadrates. They are 135 degrees on the 0 to 360 circle. It is going from first quarter phase to gibbous phase. It is a tension aspect. A sesquisquadrate is a square and a half. So it acts like a square. And it goes from energy moving outward to energy moving inward. So it's another one of those going inward to reflect, review, revalue with Venus. So with Venus, Jupiter, here are the struggles and tests to see which value systems are going to rise to the forefront over the case of or during the summer. And for me, I simplify it down to values that are inclusive, giving, sharing, and including, versus values that are exclusive, taking, hoarding, taking, and excluding. Now, Jupiter rules the retrograde polarity, Sagittarius. So Jupiter is a little more active just because of that in this retrograde cycle with Venus. It'll be one more part emphasizing the truth versus lies. And again, depending on what our philosophical orientations are, it's going to determine what we will accept as truth for ourselves. The Venus waxing sesquisquadrates to Saturn, the push between authority figures, Saturn and Capricorn, even though 2 of these aspects are in Aquarius. Saturn, the authority figures controlling and maintaining the status quo. We can see that here in the United States, which is where probably most of our listeners are. We can see this perhaps in other various countries as well, and perhaps in countries that have the power to really clamp down as authority figures and a lot less freedoms than maybe we have other places. Those may appear to be better or worse, depending on all kinds of variabilities through the coronavirus pandemic. Here in the United States, it's authority figures really attempting to maintain everything they've had through Pluto and Capricorn. And for us, many of us, it can be public outrage at the inferiority of these structures to evolve and support our social systems. Healthcare coverage, unemployment benefits, access to jobs, the business space structuring as we reopen, all of the business bankruptcies that are going to be taking place. This is the statistic that I say all the time, and I can't believe I didn't put the graph in. The United States has 4% of the world's population. We have 32% of the corona or the COVID-19 cases. We have 27% of the deaths worldwide. 4% of the world's population and 27% of the world's deaths. Tell me that we don't have an inferior healthcare system. And of course, as we look at the states or provinces or whatever they're called in various countries, as they're not sovereign, so they don't have the ability to create their own money. They have huge debt overloads as income has shrank and expenses has magnified, at least here in the United States without universal health care. This is our story. And so public outrage at overhauling monetary and banking structures could easily be coming to the surface with this Venus retrograde. And you may find an openness and curiosity amongst local and state governmental officials. How are we going to change things? How are we going to provide for our basic services and take care of all our citizens in the midst of all this? Stay tuned. This is going to be probably a hot and heavy subject in the United States. I have my public banking slide coming, but first of all, let's look at the waxing sesqui-squad traits to Pluto here, okay, as we're looking at this. And I will point out something to you in just a second. I had to make a note. So here's the struggle for both individuals and countries, individually, collectively, to evolve our social values, our social systems. Is it me versus us? Is it us versus them? This is extremely loud and clear in a country like the United States, where we don't have the social democratic system set up like we may have in other countries, specifically in the healthcare theme. And so for us in the United States, it's really exposing nationalism as we blame China, racism, ethnicity in our own countries, and of course the wealth or the haves versus have-nots, Pluto and Capricorn. And Venus and Pluto rule opposite signs, Taurus and Scorpio. So they have a lot to do with money and resources, and who has it and who does not, and who gets it and who does not. And so here again, I think these waxing sesqui-squad traits are going to have a lot to do with states, bankrupt states, here in the US at least, really having to look at different ways of funding. On a European level, it's the, Euro that has the sovereignness and those governing bodies versus the individual countries who bought into the Euro, which Britain never did. What I wanted to point out is that, again, these waxing sesqui-squad rates, they're struggles, they're tension. They're like, how do we move forward? And it's not easy. After those waxing sesqui-squad rates, eventually will come the oppositions. And so Venus will, let me get these for you correctly. Venus opposed Jupiter, August 25th. Venus opposed Pluto, August 30th. Venus opposed Saturn, September 2nd. And these will take place at 18, 23, and 26 degrees Cancer, Capricorn. You can expect, whatever the Venus retrograde struggles are, that these will come to a head in their exposure the end of August, early September, when we have the Venus and Cancer oppositions to all three of these planets in Capricorn. And this will be the ending of what we will call the conventions of the Democratic and Republican parties. This will be the heat of the presidential campaigning, whether it happens in person or digitally. Stay tuned. We'll see how that unfolds. But you may see various gubernatorial candidates running on a public banking platform. You may see the Democratic Party come out with some of this. Here's my slide. I should put this up. And again, these will all be active when you get your PowerPoint slides. I've been an advocate of the Public Banking Institute now for 12 years. Here's Ellen Brown's new book. Here's the one I'm working my way through. Because I've followed this movement for 12 years, I'm reading the book fairly easy. If you're new to it, you may you want to have a highlighter and you want to go to the glossary in the back of the book. I think when we see, again, Venus opposing Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, we're going to have to look for different monetary solutions because how we're structured right now isn't doing it. And the Mitch McConnell statement, let the states go bankrupt, I'm hoping that I see Democratic candidates play it again and again and again and again because it will just incentivize us. Is that a word? To change the system that gives the profits of a state bank back to the state coffers to be used for the poor and the elderly and Medicaid, etc. Venus is going to make 3 waxing sextiles to Chiron. And here's going to be those opportunities. Waxing sextile, 60 degrees. This is a sextile word. Opportunities for innovation in healthcare and healing modalities. This viral pandemic is hitting people of color the worst in the United States. And so we're going to see some states being innovative in addressing it and others that do not. And yet it's going to be such an issue. It's exploding right now in the state of Georgia. And I see it being full blown into a campaign issues, however their local and state races go, and congressional with those that are involved, and people saying we've got to change things for all of us. And this also can bring about some possibilities with new drugs, vaccines, etc. I did a public talk for EA Zoom, a coronavirus update. You can go there and locate it. I am not going to be an advocate, yes or no, for vaccines. I've been on both sides of the fence. I've helped raise a young adult child who's never had vaccines in his life and is doing just fine. But he's also on our alternative energetic balancing program since he was 6 years old. So he's exposed to whooping cough. He picks up on the balancing frequency. He's exposed to the coronavirus. We have 11 frequencies to cover all the variations. But I also have had a close family member of a 2-year-old son pass from bacterial meningitis. So there is a time and place for drugs and vaccines. And I am not necessarily going to condemn consensus world. They are allowed their choice. I just want to be allowed my choice. I will come down on the side of mandatory vaccines as a no. But free choice, it's pretty much where I'm at with this subject. And of course, Chiron in Aries, starting a new 51-year healing cycle, especially with the alternative healing modalities. We can also recognize the need for improvements in diet, exercise, and rest. This is what I was speaking to with Leroy and I earlier. There's no substitute for diet or exercise or rest. And having the healthiest immune system possible helps you no matter what's going on in the world. And so what ideas does Venus give you during this retrograde cycle as it meets Chiron? And then, of course, Uranus gets into part of this health picture as well. Venus makes 3 waxing semi-sextiles, 30 degrees beyond Uranus. Hasn't moved very far. Uranus admits to that 7-year cycle through Taurus. There's going to be newly merging ideas for our survival instincts, Venus. And these ideas are going to be inclusive and exclusive. And there can be long-term health and medical trends that are germinating this spring as Venus made the conjunction to Uranus, and then as Venus slows down and germinates on all these ideas, retrograde in Gemini, and then starts moving forward from Uranus very slowly. Technologically, genetic and genomic manipulating. They have discovered the genome, if I'm pronouncing it right, of the coronavirus, and they're tracking all the different variations of it. And there's one that's coming out to be the strongest. And by the way, I also am from the perspective that this naturally mutated from animal to human. It has been going on forever. We have had virus and bacteria, fungi, mutate from animals to humans since the beginning of time. So far, what I have been able to see, Gemini, factually, I don't subscribe to the lab created. I am more on it mutated organically. But we may find biometric chips and tattoos that can come along. And of course, this is going to speed up augmented reality diagnostics. It's actually, we don't use the word diagnostic, we use evaluation. It's actually what exists in the world of my energetic balancing. I'm going to put the link on this slide for you in case you want more information on it. I'll make it a hyperlink. But we can take a photograph and measure the frequency of a virus or a bacteria and provide the neutralizing or balancing or healing frequency. We've found 11 variations so far to this new coronavirus. That's how much it's mutated. And of course, some of these other emerging ideas are going to be totally in the natural world. All the buzz about everybody's going to go back and have their gardens again that they did, a dozen years ago with the Great Recession. Victory gardens is what they called them in World War II. The community gardens that are going to pop up, that are there, that are going to expand. The food co-ops that exist all over. And of course, how many of us are recognizing the need for localizing food sustainability, the horrible conditions of meat factories, not just in the US, but probably all across the world. First of all, we eat too much meat. Our systems are much healthier when we're more plant-based. And, just by necessity, some of these things are going to come along and change. And the question's going to be through Uranus in Taurus. And then as Uranus moves into Gemini, will they sustain and will they expand? Stay tuned. We'll find out. Venus also, here's what most of us know about with the Venus retrograde cycle. Venus making those waxing squares to Neptune 3 times. And if you look at your screen, all 3 of them are taking place along that 20-21 degrees Gemini Pisces. You may want to see if you have that active in your chart. Do you have 18 to 23 degrees, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces in your chart? This is where the Venus Neptune will hit you quite strongly. While Neptune has rulership of the immune system in general, Venus has specific rulership of white blood cells. And it's the white blood cells that fight off the toxins and germs in our system. If your white blood cell count rises, that means you have something in your system your body is trying to fight off, which is a natural thing that will happen with, again, this coronavirus pandemic. We just had the first of the 3 Venus waxing squares to Neptune. One more time, we're already starting to see in the news that there are certain places relaxing social distancing and starting to see increases in the cases of COVID-19 again. These are waxing squares, so this is the struggle to manifest crises in action. Our deepest ideals and beliefs, what are they? There can be confusion and or arguments around our morality and ethics. Are we practicing what we preach? Or are we stating one thing while we do the opposite? One more time, if we have any compromised immune systems, they are, the most vulnerable with this pandemic. And at least here in the United States, our patriarchally based systems are pretty much ignoring a lot of the masses that are generally of another race or ethnicity or in poverty. I want to point out that the Neptune transits, not only, is Neptune active with Venus in the sky during the Venus retrograde cycle, Neptune, and therefore Venus, are quite active in the chart of both the United States for July 4th, 1776, and Donald Trump. Here's a listing. Transiting Neptune is making last quarter squares to the US Mars in Gemini, and it's going to then make 5 oppositions to the US Neptune in Virgo. Neptune transiting Pisces made 3 last quarter squares to Trump's Uranus in Gemini. Neptune is going to square the nodal axis in Gemini Sag 5 times in his chart. It's going to first quarter square his moon 3 times. And then it's going to last quarter square his sun 5 times. Donald Trump has 4 intense years that he's in the midst of. And so the Venus retrograde cycle in Gemini can act like a trigger to all of these Neptune transits, activating various events and words, and of course, evolving our beliefs and values, Neptune and Venus. Here's the US chart. I use the Gemini rising, but this is going to be accurate for the Sagittarius rising as well. On July 4th, what I want to point out here for you in red is that 2020 will see transiting Saturn hit the natal US Pluto retrograde 3 times, and it will see transiting Jupiter hit or oppose the natal Mercury in Cancer retrograde 3 times. This is one of the archetypes, the natal Mercury-Pluto oppositions, both retrograde. This is one of the archetypes that is the whole include versus exclude in the United States. Of course, so is the Gemini, Mars in Gemini squares to Neptune in Virgo. And Venus is going to turn retrograde just beyond the US. Mars at 22 degrees Gemini, 1 degree past it turning retrograde. It's squatted on it right now by orb. You can see here's the Neptune transit up there. Here's Mars and Pisces starting to get involved. So this is not only physically describing the healthcare and the health pandemic in this country. It's describing our beliefs around it. It's describing our choices of how we're going to address it. I said the Mars in Gemini squared in Neptune in Virgo is also Gemini duality, inclusive versus exclusive. The other one that's looked at is Saturn in Libra square the natal sun in Cancer. Two natal squares and one opposition that emphasize the include versus exclude. So if you're wondering why is the United States so polarized, there you go. There's the aspects in the July 4th, 1776 chart. And with the Saturn, Jupiter, Pluto, stellium, balsamic, this Pluto, it's just intensifying what no longer works. The Venus retrograde cycle in Gemini, by generically, is suggesting ideas of what we can change and what we can do differently. Venus will go 3 times over that Uranus in Gemini. Venus also will activate a grand trine between the moon in Aquarius, the public in a chart, and Saturn in Libra, the powers that be and authority figures. And the moon in Aquarius, it describes those ways in which parts of our country are so innovative, the leaders in technology. But it will also then, being an air sign, describe part of this split that we have between include versus exclude, haves versus have-nots. Oh, on a side note here, it's snowing. We are having a cold streak in the northern plains. I had to cover some of my delicate plants. I'm just telling Leroy down in the basement, it's snowing. Oh boy, hopefully this is the last one. But this Venus activation, we have planets in the air trine natally. It's just activating choosing. What's that broader collective in the United States going to choose? Stay tuned, we'll see. So here's the dates. I put 2 Venus US slides up. Here's the conjunctions that Venus does 3 times to Uranus and Mars, and then the final square to Neptune. And again, I probably described most of this, but our country's history swings between including, excluding, including, excluding. We go back and forth and back and forth. What I do want to point out, though, I'll read it to you and then we'll back up 1 minute. Throughout history, economic downturns have almost always been triggered when outer planets hit the natal Mars-Neptune square. Let me show you visually. Here's Mars at 21 Gemini, square to Neptune at 22.5 Virgo. Remember, I said Neptune is squaring Mars this year, and Neptune is opposing itself 5 times this year, next year. And I kept going, well, there's the timing. I wonder what I wonder what's going to be the trigger for the economic downturn. Here it is. And it may turn out to be greater than anything that we've seen since the Great Depression in the 1930s. It may be even worse than that. And I got the opinion, intuitive hit that no matter how they tell you things are going to boomerang back, I don't think so in this country. And it's the Neptune hits to the Mars Neptune that is probably the biggest indicator of my comment like this. We've got the Neptune oppositions 5 times. Where is the collective belief system in this country? And we have a natal Neptune in Virgo. I mean, the distortions of Virgo can get into a lot of cruelty. We'll see if Neptune in Pisces brings about more inclusiveness. Now here's the trines that Venus makes to Saturn and the moon that initiate that grand trine. And just because it's a grand trine, don't think that it's necessarily going to be smooth and easy conversations. It's Neptune, or excuse me, it's Moon in Aquarius, the elitism between the haves and the have-nots, or the elitism between races in this country. There can be an intensity of debate going on in the media and on social media, especially over the future of our country. And do we value all citizens? Time will tell. Also shows you in this country how much our social relationships have been taken into the digital realm. Zoom meetings. My family lives all in the same community now, and we're all on my energetic balancing program. So we haven't advertised it, but we've been pretty much socializing together all the way through this. Everybody's healthy and well, and we have 2 family members in law enforcement. Leroy's family, we had a wonderful Zoom meeting happy hour a month or so ago. So we've been initiated into it ourselves. Here's Donald Trump's chart. And if you follow his chart, you are aware that Neptune is already hitting the Gemini Sagittarius polarity from 2019 to 2022 that I've already described, transiting Neptune here in his 7th house. The public who, just idolizes him and sees him as the chosen one, and the public who Neptune in Pisces go wide-eyed in disbelief that you can listen to these words that come out of his mouth and trust anything that he says. Is Venus retrograde in Gemini going to expose the extremes of the lying? And maybe a critical mass of support that says, I got to trust the scientists, not this selfish person. We have 3 eclipses coming up in the North Node solar eclipse season. You could see them on your screen. I already pointed out the one June 5th. That'll be at 1516 Gemini Sag, hitting on his entire Gemini Sagittarius stellium. So I expect him to be even more triggered. Trump will have his 4th nodal axis return October 29th, days before the US election. I did a public talk on EA Zoom on Donald Trump's 2020 forecasts. And back then I said it's going to take an extreme miracle for him not to be re-elected. Well, little did I know how my words could be interpreted. I don't know if I'd call this a pandemic a miracle, but I did feel on a broader level, sooner or later, the universe was going to bring a comeuppance to this person that he couldn't lie his way through. any eclipse is strong for Donald Trump because he was born on a lunar eclipse. This whole year will be stronger yet, as you can already see, with how the sun's on his natal sun, the moon will be on his natal moon with this upcoming lunar. Here are your slides. Red shows the conjunctions and oppositions. Green shows trines and sextiles that are happening as well. I was curious as to the date that he said made the comments at his daily press briefings on the pandemic, the disinfectant statement of ingesting or taking up or whatever disinfectants that had Lysol and other brands say, please do not do this. He made those comments April 23rd and then backtracked them on the 24th and the 25th. And as you can see, we had Venus trine his natal Jupiter in Libra, 2 air signs in their distortion. Let's see what I can say and see what I can get away with. And then, of course, coming along with the shock that, people took him at his word and it was just a joke and sarcasm. Stay tuned. We have Venus literally stationary retrograde in Gemini opposing this moon in Sag. I think this is someone who might be quite emotionally frustrated right now and who I think will be quite emotionally frustrated throughout the whole summer, at least through the Venus retrograde cycle with 3 different eclipses to get through. Here is Venus turning stationary direct. And as this happens at 5 degrees Gemini, I did all charts 0 Aries rising for Washington, D.C., 0 Aries to make it relative no matter what time zone we live in. As I said, Mars was going to come over Neptune. Mars has been in Pisces through most of the Venus retrograde cycle. Mars comes into squaring the nodes of the moon and it pulls Neptune into squaring the nodes of the moon. These two right here in Pisces and, the whole Gemini Sagittarius breath thing. I don't think our cloth masks are going to leave very soon. I disliked mine the first time I put it on. I was claustrophobic. I won't go into the past life details of that. And I had to really make some efforts, Gemini, to breathe through it. That's getting easier. Now I can do it pretty good. I don't do it in all public places in my small community, but I do it in the grocery store. I do it in a public crowded place that we come across. I just don't know that they're going to move on fast. We either have to develop our herd immunity, where enough of us have been exposed, develop the antibodies, that it's no big deal anymore, and or until a vaccine or some type of antibody drug may be created. So that's the last of my slides. I always like to put this one in. This is from my last Venus retrograde cycle. The ultimate Venus retrograde condition is identification with God Goddess, the ultimate value. Questions, comments from anybody on anything that I have said? Leroy? Questions, comments from the board? And so I left up the 2-part series I did in Saturn with Saturn in Aquarius. And I just recently did the nodal axis in Gemini Sag. That was a lot of slides in that one, a lot of information. And as you can see, Venus or Mercury retrograde coming up. And then here's the date of the public EA Zoom meeting I did on the coronavirus update. And I turned out to be mainly one public figure, Bill Gates, if you're interested in that and emerging trends. And so I'll check in with Leroy one more time. Any
Yeah, just
comments?
to know that those, all those um, past webinars are posted on the forecasting webinars page for repurchase. You get the PDF download that's archived on your account pages forever, and you can get all the active links to the webinar are right there on the first page of that PDF. So go ahead and get those if you'd like, and this will be posted in the same place probably in the next 24 to 48 hours. Okay, hold on a second. We have a couple questions, Kimmy.
Mm-hmm.
Just talk a moment about Venus in Gemini retrograde as a conjunction natal Venus in Gemini.
Well, you're having a Venus return, and if you're going to get it 3 times, there is major shifting necessary in your value systems. And so where are you, quote unquote, mentally stuck and looking at something from one perspective? Now, what could happen with Venus retrograde natally, you literally had only one value system, one perspective of relationships in prior lives. And the Venus retrograde is pointing towards Sag, and it's asking you to really develop a more holistic perspective in regards to your values. And so the Venus retrograde over it is emphasizing that once again. And if you get it 3 times, 3 chances to get it right, to really evolve how you look at your world, how you look at your relationships, how you look at your resources, how you look at relationships between yourself and everyone and everything.
Thank you. Okay, so here's more of a timing question. What if the relationship ends before the retrograde begins?
Well, Venus retrograde is going to have you then refocus on a relationship with yourself. One of the things that naturally happens to us when we get into an intimate relationship, and this is just by nature of the consensus consciousness being so vast, approximately 7 out of 10 souls. And this is true because of all the patriarchal conditionings for the last 6,000 years. We have a tendency when we get into an intimate relationship over time to compromise on ourselves for the sake of the relationship. And sometimes the longer we've been in it, the more we compromise. Extreme example is the husband or wife who files for divorce 30 years later, 40 years later. I can't compromise on myself in this relationship any longer. So if you have a recent ending or why in the road with an intimate relationship, this Venus retrograde is going to be an opportunity to refocus on yourself. And you can just ask the Gemini question, am I this or am I that? Is this important to me or is that important to me? And you just can go through all of your values, all your beliefs, all your issues, all the situations or things that didn't work out in the relationship, And it gives you an opportunity to clarify what is of value and importance to yourself and to recommit to that relationship with yourself. You know, there's this theory, inner attracts outer. And so relationships outside of yourself are only as healthy as the relationship you have within yourself. And during a Venus retrograde, single, married, anything in between, all over the place, a Venus retrograde is to renew our relationship with ourselves. And the signs and the houses just describe the details.
All right. Thank you, Kimmy. That's it on the board.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And so look for this to show up as, I think, a link in your inbox, right, Leroy? In
I would
a
say
day or so?
you're going to get a follow-up email from the GoToWebinar webinar service, and there will be a link in that follow-up email directly to this PDF external of the website. So yeah, you just be looking for that in the next 24 to 48 hours, and just email me if there's anything contradictory to that.
All right. Thank you, Leroy. Thank you very much, everyone. And one more time, our YouTube channel is back. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all the prayers and well wishes. I'll see you again down the road. Good night.